Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
One of Australia's leading beer judges.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
The difference between getting good quality fresh hops, it just translates straight through into the beer.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Welcome back to the show, and this episode we're talking with one of American distilling's leading lights. In 2015, 28-year-old Marianne Eaves became Kentucky's first female bourbon master distiller since Prohibition. With a background in chemical engineering, Marianne found her way into the bourbon industry via an internship at Brown-Forman, the company behind whiskey brands such as Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve and Old Forrester. By 2014, she had become master taster at the company and was on track to succeed Chris Morris as Woodford's master distiller. But then came the unique offer to work on the resurrection of the Old Taylor Distillery, an incredibly ambitious project. The historic distillery, which is now known as Castle & Key, had fallen into disrepair since it was shuttered in 1972. Marianne has since moved on from Castle & Key and is now consulting on a host of interesting distilling projects right across the US. It was a pleasure to have Marianne join me from Texas for this interview, which you'll hear in just a moment. What I love about Australian craft spirits is that our distillers are truly free to experiment. We aren't governed by rules and traditions. That's why the flavour and character of Australian spirits is so unique. But it takes distilling prowess and another critical ingredient to bring these products to market, and that ingredient is Bintani. Bintani supplies distillers with malts of all colours, flavours and aromas. They have a leading range of yeast and other ingredients, and the professional expertise to help distillers create the spirits of their dreams. Make Bintani your partner in taste and quality. Now, Marianne, as I understand it, you were born in Kentucky, but it wasn't until much later in life that you actually discovered bourbon.
Actually, I was born in Tennessee, not too far away from Kentucky, but we moved there when I was really small. So essentially, Kentucky my whole life. But yeah, I grew up in a dry county, which means there weren't really bars to speak of, didn't see alcohol much. My parents didn't drink around the house much, so I wasn't brought up in the bourbon culture that everybody kind of expects from Kentuckians.
So how did you actually find your way into bourbon then?
It's interesting. I was pretty comfortable in more male-dominated fields. I took auto shop in high school and actually was looking into biodiesel, renewable energy, something like that. I went into chemical engineering in college, and once it came time to look for an internship, I was interviewing with everybody, and my choices were anywhere from soy protein extraction to making roofing adhesives to renewable energy and also making bourbon. And of all of those things, I thought making bourbon sounded the most fun. And if I was going to spend the next several years, between really grueling coursework and a job, might as well make it one that's really fun. And turns out that they liked me as well and kept me on there at Brown-Forman for 6 years.
So what exactly were you doing for Brown-Forman when you started, and what particular products were you working on?
Well, I started in research and development, and that's the group that I was hired into as a process R&D engineer. What that means, essentially, I was working on process improvement, product improvement initiatives on all of the Brown-Forman brands globally. So I worked a ton with their whiskey brands, a lot with Jack Daniel's, a lot with Woodford Reserve and Old Forrester. I did some work on Early Times and even their Canadian whiskey brands, but also working on vodka projects, working in tequila factories, also working with interesting liqueurs. And since I was a part of the research and development group, I was also encouraged to make unique things. So part of my job, my office I like to joke, was in the broom closet across from the pilot plant there at Brown-Forman. So essentially they're a little micro distillery. And I was tasked with keeping it running at least once a month, making something different, something unique. Could be a whiskey, could be something that's never been made before, it could be something that you can't really make in the US. So we made Baijiu and cachaça and chestnut whiskey and all these weird things that will probably never see the light of day through Brown-Forman's portfolio, but really gave me the opportunity to explore and innovate and learn a ton in a very condensed amount of time. So I started in R&D. When I moved on from Brown-Forman in 2015, I was still a part of the R&D group. I had just grown my marketing skill set as well and was working as Chris Morris from Woodford Reserve as his protege and master taster of Brown-Forman's Kentucky whiskey and bourbon portfolio.
So was there a particular moment that you really started to fall in love with bourbon and decided that you were going to be able to make a career out of it?
It's funny, I knew nothing about it. I didn't have a taste for it. I would walk around my department in the engineering group and just ask people, what can I do? What do I need to do to start at least not hating it? I need to at least tolerate it so that I can understand whether I'm doing a good job or not, like succeeding at my job. So I just started working on the sensory panels there at Brown-Forman. We were tasting everything, not just whiskeys, but all the different spirits that they were producing and the experimental things that they were producing. And I found myself more and more being able to appreciate the different flavors and the whiskeys that they were making. So it was one product that actually when I was a part of the team there in R&D, we started the research on a new product just as I was starting there as an intern, and that was the Woodford Double Oaked. And over the course of the next couple years, I got to see all the development of that product and really fell in love with the profile, because the way that they treat that second barrel just brings out all of this beautiful sweetness. It's like a dessert bourbon. And that was the turning point for my palate, something that I really appreciated, those caramel and chocolate and vanilla notes in double oaked, but also this spice and the fruit and the oak flavors and the grainy notes. I was able to start picking those out in other whiskeys and able to appreciate them more and more.
How do you actually gain that title of Master Taster?
That title, Master Taster, given to me at Brown-Forman, they actually have their own in-house training program that was developed by Master Distiller Chris Morris. So it was a very specific, pretty intense process. I already had a technical background, having a chemical engineering degree, and had already been there for several years and participating in their sensory panels in the sensory department. So it was just a matter of getting to that next level, which required working with Chris to create the blends for the different brands, really becoming very intimately aware and involved in what made each brand unique, how to keep those profiles consistent, and also identifying off notes, but also having this very attuned palate memory so that I would be able to identify if something were off, even just slightly, in any product, whether it was just coming off the still or something that had been in the warehouse for 12 years.
What made you decide to leave Brown-Forman and take up the role at Castle & Key?
I was not looking for another job when the two owners, the founding partners of Castle & Key, approached me. One of the founding partners, Wes Murray, sent me a message through LinkedIn and just invited me to come out and see the property. They wanted to introduce me to the project, and they said, they had heard of me and I would be a good contact for them. It wasn't a job offer, at least not right off the bat. I think that they had an idea that they wanted to try and lure me away, but I wasn't aware that that was the intent. So I took my time. Wes liked to say that I blew him off several times. But I was busy. I was working, my R&D job and also my marketing job there at Brown-Forman. So I was a busy lady doing all the things. And eventually, I just think it was curiosity that got the best of me. And once I realized what the Old Taylor Distillery was, what it meant to the industry, and the state that it had arrived in, with all the windows broken, the roofs collapsing, it being torn apart by architectural salvage companies. History was fading away. I felt a responsibility, almost a calling, to be a part of the team to resurrect that beautiful, historic bourbon icon.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's smoky ginger ale as the perfect accompaniment to some of my favourite bourbons and whiskies. Many Australians probably won't have actually heard of the Old Taylor Distillery. Can you give us a bit of a rundown of that distillery and its significance to Kentucky bourbon?
Mm-hmm. The Old Taylor Distillery was started by a prominent character in the history of the bourbon industry named Colonel E.H. Taylor. He had been many things in Kentucky: a politician, a banker, a commodities trader, and kind of failed at all of those things, but found his niche in producing whiskey. So he had this dream of building a destination distillery in Kentucky, which had never been done before. Through his travels and education in Europe, he decided to build a limestone castle in the rolling hills and in the backcountry of Kentucky, kind of nestled right by the Kentucky River. Beautiful, beautiful setting. You really felt like you were transported to another place when you arrived at Old Taylor. He was also touted for making some of the highest quality product at the time. It was actually built in the late 1800s, in 1887. So this was 10 years before the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897 was passed. And he fought really hard for transparency and quality in the industry. When folks hear about the distillery, now named Castle and Key, the castle is pretty obvious. It smacks you in the face as soon as you see it kind of emerge out of the brush. But when you get a little bit further down into the property, you see this beautiful keyhole-shaped spring pool that serves as the water source for the product that's produced there. It is a Herculean project, taking that distillery that was overrun by nature and animals and trespassers to make it productive again. I got on the site there at the beginning of 2015, and by the end of 2016, I had the stills going again for the first time in nearly half a century.
And did the founders dictate to you what sort of spirits they wanted produced there, or did you pretty much have free rein?
They had a couple ideas which I thought were fitting. So, making a more traditional whiskey that would honor what Colonel Taylor had produced there. But they really did leave it completely up to me to define the process, source the ingredients, and figure out how it would all come together with the flavor profile and all of that good stuff.
And what about the title of Bourbon Master Distiller? How do you actually attain that particular title?
So it's different for every place. Again, kind of like the Master Distiller or Master Taster training program at Brown-Forman. Every bourbon producer kind of has their own way of going about deciding who will be their master distiller, who will perform that job or have the title. So in some places, it's something that the guy that bought the place gives themselves. It's a little bit of a self proclamation. In other cases, it's having the right last name. In the case of Brown-Forman and, eventually moving on to Castle and Key, it's being a really excellent technical distiller. So Brown-Forman had never had a family member as a master distiller. So I was really excited to even have the opportunity to train under Chris Morris, and I would have eventually become the Woodford master distiller, but then having the opportunity to do the job at an even more technically advanced or challenging level, going to Castle and Key, rebuilding the distillery, developing the brands. This is not something that every master distiller gets to do. This is something that some master distillers will never get to do because they're simply taking a recipe and continuing operating a facility that's been built, and they get handed the keys and say, don't screw anything up.
Castle and Key is yet to release its first whiskies. The company produced various different bourbon and rye recipes while Marianne was there.
4 different bourbon recipes, a rye-based whiskey with white corn, a wheat bourbon with white corn, and the 2 different bourbon recipes had 2 different yeast strains. So that's why I say there were 4 recipes. And the rye whiskey recipe I made with the same 2 different yeast strains as well. So there's quite a mix of unique recipes there in the warehouse. And my intention with creating all those different recipes with the different yeast strains was to have the opportunity, once it was mature, to blend it in a way that really got at that historic profile. I, of course, will not be involved. At least it doesn't look that way. So I don't know what the end product will look like or taste like at this point. But each individual whiskey, I spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to put together. So it's going to be something that's delicious. I just don't know if it'll be the vision that I had originally or not.
What are some of the biggest innovations currently happening in American whiskey?
I hear people talking about innovation in a way that kind of gets me frustrated, if I'm being honest. Just looking at a different location in the warehouse or adjusting the proof level on the product that you're releasing, to me, is not innovative. A unique barrel finish can be exciting, but it's been done so many times. There are folks that are looking at unique grains, which again can be interesting, but has been done a million different ways in a million different places. So I want to look at innovation from a total different lens, and I'm hoping that I have the opportunity to start to have those conversations and impact some new brands that are going to be hitting the market in the next couple years. But thinking about more the process and looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way rather than just, okay, let's get the cheapest commodity corn. We'll make it the same way that everybody else does. We'll age it for the same amount of time that people usually age their product for, put it in the standard barrel, and then release it at cask strength and say it's something special. I think that once the bourbon consumer really starts to dig in and understand the details of the processes a little bit more, you come to find that I'm an engineer. So I really nerd out on those technical details, the times, the temperatures, the processes in which the flavor is developed. So doing something unique with the cooking process or the fermentation process that might speak more to what they do in agave-based spirits, or a maturation style that speaks more to what they do in the rum industry. So I'm looking for ways to be inspired by other spirit categories. That was one of the motivations for moving on from Castle and Key, was to hopefully get some experience in spirits that are not just Kentucky bourbon. I spent 10 years making some product that I'm really, really proud of at Brown-Forman and Castle and Key, but I do believe that we're not done innovating in this industry. It's got to be more than just the same old grain and barrel and proof adjustments.
Do you think the rules around bourbon production are too restrictive for distillers?
It does appear that way. There are lots more regulations on bourbon than there are on global whiskey. You're restricted by distillation proof and barrel entry proof and the type of barrel and the type of grain and all of these things. However, like I mentioned, I think there are opportunities in the style and technique and the treatment that you go about proceeding with that distillation proof or that barrel entry proof or the length of maturation that can have a significant impact on the way the flavors are created and developed that would make something innovative and unique, but still staying within the TTB regulation to be able to call it a true bourbon.
Have you had much exposure to world whiskies outside of the States?
More and more. For 9 months of the time between now and when I left Castle and Key, I was pregnant. So I now have a beautiful 3.5-month-old baby girl. So I'm finally kind of easing my way back into sampling all the styles that the world has to offer. So I've really been focusing more on tasting unique styles produced within the U.S. There are bourbon distilleries in every state, so I've had the opportunity to travel over the last couple years and get to experience the wide array of production techniques and equipment and flavor profiles that are being produced just in the US. And I've been inspired. But as I continue to move forward, I do hope to really dig into a little bit more into Scotch and Irish whiskey and Japanese whiskey and Canadian whiskey and even some places that don't traditionally make whiskey, and learning about their national spirit and what they love.
Well, congratulations on the baby.
Thank you.
Tell me about some of the other projects that you're currently working on as a distilling consultant.
Sure thing. So I had been working on a brandy project with a woman called Lindsay Hoops in California. Her father started a vineyard and she has taken it over, and she wanted to start a line of spirits primarily to help recover some of the stock that had been damaged in the 2017 fires. So it was a significant loss to that 2017 crop. And she had an idea, we could, even though it's not fit to go in a bottle with the Hoops name, it's still excellent product and should be consumed somehow. And when we were talking about it first, toward the end of 2018, I think, I got really inspired to hear her story. But it wasn't until I left Castle and Key that I was able to actually get involved with her in that project. So looking at some really unique smoky Cabernet brandies, a rosé brandy, some Chardonnay that we may turn into a grape-based gin, looking at some different styles of vermouth. It's going to be a really fun project. So that's something that's kind of out of my wheelhouse. I'd never produced a brandy before, but I'm been really excited by what we've got off the stills and played around with so far. I've also been doing some more behind the scenes, like technical work. So a few distilleries that had been making product for a decade and having success, but also, at a turning point where they were able to start growing and buying larger equipment and doing things in a little bit different way. So asking about, more consistent processes and different fermentation techniques and getting more specialized yeast strains and all this stuff that I just absolutely love to nerd out on. And just recently, you may have heard of a new product that I have been really excited to be involved with. It's a blended Tennessee whiskey called Sweetens Cove that has some kind of all-star backers. It was a 13-year-old sourced bourbon that I got to batch together in 5 different batches and have been really pleased with the way it's been received now that it's out in the world. But a few other projects kind of up my sleeve, one in rum that I'm also really excited about, doing a kind of bespoke product for a hotel group. That one's not fully kicked off yet, so I can't tell you all the details of it, but again, excited to do something that's a little bit new for me.
With the Sweetens Cove project, 13 years is obviously a very long time for whiskey to be sitting in new American oak. What do you think is the longest time that you can mature bourbon for?
There are lots of different opinions to answer this question. When I was working for Brown-Forman, I would have told you, I thought that around 9 years old, that's when you stop really getting good things from the barrel, and the oak just continues to double and double and double over time. The biggest risk, I think, is it concentrating to the point that there's almost nothing left or nothing left in the barrel. The evaporation, the angel share is to such a level that your loss is really, really great up above, 9 or 10 years old. I've had some whiskeys at 8 years old that I felt like I was chewing on pencil shavings. And then this 13-year-old product that I blended for Sweetens Cove that was tropical fruit and graham crackers and, butterscotch and apple and all these, cinnamon, baking spices, black pepper, leather, some smokehouse, like really unique, interesting flavors coming out of these old barrels. So while there was a lot of oak, I found enough really fun kind of showstopper barrels within the 100-barrel lot that I was able to assemble batches that were, at the end of the day, still very balanced. A lot of oak, a lot of vanilla, but having that floral note, the fruit note, the sweet notes, the grain notes, all coming through to balance the wood.
Do you see yourself continuing with the consulting indefinitely, or do you plan on taking up another more long-term master distiller role at some stage?
I do have ambitions of creating a brand of my own and starting a distillery, maybe more than one distillery. We'll see how life evolves. But for now, I'm really happy to be able to make all of these really interesting projects with some really passionate, cool people. One thing that I'm really blessed about is that I can be a little more particular in who I'm working with. I have the ability to wait for projects that I'm just as passionate about as the people who are getting them started. So I don't necessarily have to jump right on board and make Joe Schmo moonshine, which, some moonshines are great. There's a lot of them out there. But I can wait for really interesting products like Sweetens Cove that are elevated and looking, to eventually build my name to a point where once I have the opportunity to release my own brand, that my name will speak for the quality kind of on its own.
Marianne, thanks so much for joining us on the show, and we look forward to hearing more about these many different projects that you're working on at the moment.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and look forward to keeping in touch.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links, and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at by James Atkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.